Good evening, everybody. I'm Jeanette Collenberg, and I'm happy to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the League of Women Voters, the first teal unit that meets here at Horizon House. Our attention tonight is on immigration. And I want to particularly call your attention to a report that has just been done by the League of Women Voters of Washington entitled Welcoming Immigrants to Washington, the State Study. It's really excellent. And I have copies up here in front if you'd like to have a copy, or you can get one by going to the League of Women Voters website and download it, or read it online if that's your thing. It's the State League of Women Voters, though, not the Seattle League, so be sure you go to the right one. The stress of the League study is about welcome, and that is something that has been emphasized in Washington State. I particularly like the quote that they use from Governor Inslee, who issued an executive order in 2017 reaffirming, quote, that the state of Washington shall remain a welcoming jurisdiction that embraces diversity with compassion and tolerance and recognizes the value of immigrants. End quote. I'm sure that Governor Ferguson shares the same views, and these are very different from the kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric we're hearing out of the other Washington. We will be giving deeper attention to these issues around immigration in our meeting tonight. Most of you, I'm sure, know our fellow resident, Ilona Bray, and admire her very much, know her story, how she grew up in war-torn Lithuania, was invaded by the Nazis and then the Soviets, fled with her family to Germany, and eventually came to the United States. Her daughter, Ilona, is going to be our speaker tonight. So we're very pleased that Ilona is here and that Ina is sharing her with us. Ilona comes to us from Ithaca, New York, though she grew up in Seattle and received her law degree and a master's degree in East Asian Chinese studies from the University of Washington. She has practiced law in corporate and nonprofit settings, as well as in a solo practice, where she represented immigrant clients seeking asylum, family-based visas, and more. She has also volunteered extensively, including a 6-month fellowship at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project here in Seattle, and a 6-month internship at Amnesty International in London. Since the year 2000, Ilona has been working at Nolo, a publisher of self-help law books, as a writer and editor. Many of her books have become NOLA bestsellers and award winners. In her spare time, of course you wonder what spare time she has, Ilona enjoys swimming, gardening, cooking healthy meals, and also writing children's books. Some of you may remember when she was here before, she told about her children's books. A woman of many talents. We are so pleased that Ilona is here today to share her experience with us tonight. She is going to offer us a historical look at how the United States protects or fails to protect people fleeing persecution. She will also share her experience representing asylum seekers in the United States. And now I'm very pleased to turn the meeting over to Ilona. Better leave you the mic.
I've been known to yell. Thank you, Jeanette, and the League of Women Voters. It's lovely to see all of you. It's sort of a sea of green, actually. So happy St. Patrick's Day. I seem to be wearing no green, but I am wearing a lot of Monday markets, so I think I'll fit right in here. Yeah. So I've obviously chosen a bit of a slice of immigration law. We could be here all night if I went much beyond, and since I'm jet lagged and this is already my bedtime, all night is probably not a good idea. But at the moment, refugee and asylum law and policy ripple across a lot, including border policy, including how we treat the most vulnerable populations in the United States. So I'm going to do a little bit of history, a little bit of current events, hopefully get us involved in thinking about what makes sense. I've got about 20 slides here for those counting. Some will be short, some long. But let's get started and see if this works. Not yet. How about that? Okay, this worked in the setup. Hello. Yeah, right. Arrow key. Tech support. I'll give you a hint as to my first question, actually, while Chase has a look at this. Oh, now how? This is like a car mechanic. Oh, it's okay. Let's see if I have the magic touch. Okay, there we go. So before I tell you what the law and policy are, I thought it would be good to get us just sort of thinking about, if we were the policy makers, what would make sense? You know, who should we protect? Should the United States be providing refuge to people who are fleeing desperate situations around the world? And don't feel you have to come up with your own personal argument. I thought maybe we could just do a little popcorning of making the case for why we should protect others, and then come up with some thoughts about what the counter arguments are. You know, why not? So if people just want to call out, like starting with some reasons for the, you know, protection of the vulnerable from other countries, I'll try and hear and repeat. Any thoughts? It's what? It's who we are. Okay. Anybody else? Humanitarian. Poverty. International law. We're going to get to that, yeah. We have the room. Saving lives. Nation of immigrants. And I missed one here. Contributions immigrants make. Okay. And was there another here? We need good people. Great. Returning the favor. Interesting. Okay. How about those counter arguments? What are the reasons to? There are millions of people being persecuted. Don't be shy. Taxes our education department. Interesting. Sorry, I couldn't quite hear. Danger of retribution. Okay. Anything else? All right. So bopping down to my next question, assuming that we say, okay, some folks should be let in, any thoughts about how do we set limits? Who is the most worthy or needy or whatever it is? Popcorn again, if you can. Relatives. Fleeing persecution, okay. So fulfilling roles in the U.S. workforce, like in the fields that people here won't take. Anything else? Okay, those fearing for their lives. All right, well now let's move on, if the arrow permits me, to a little more about what really is. I wanted to do a quick sweep through time just to ground us in immigration history. So we didn't always have immigration laws. I'm sure the Native Americans wished they had written some immigration laws. But it seemed like a great big open country when folks from Europe were first moving in. They didn't create a Bureau of Immigration until 1891 that had the power to actually admit or, no doubt, deny immigrants. And there wasn't really a concept of refugees, and there were no numerical limits. Then came the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 20, which, don't ask me the history, but I know it produced a big number of immigrants. And for the little voice in our head that might be wondering, why do Mexicans always come north, I'm going to bop ahead for a second to this map, which shows where Mexico used to be. So before I moved to Ithaca, I spent the previous 30 years living in Oakland, California, which is probably right in there somewhere. In other words, a lot of Mexico used to be in the United States, so it's sort of no wonder that they look at us a little funny when we're so fussy about our borders. But anyway, I'm going to go back to the other slide. So that saw a big influx of immigrants. Then in 1917, they decided, okay, it's time to have an actual immigration act. And they came up with a lovely list of people to keep out. I won't read them all, but you get the picture. Feeble-minded, idiots, imbeciles, etc. There was a concession made in the literacy part of the test. There was a requirement that applicants had to read 30 to 40 words in their own language, at least. But there was an exception for refugees fleeing religious persecution. So we're seeing a little bit of mention of refugees. Then 1921, they added a quota system, and mostly it seemed like that was meant to limit both Catholic and Jewish entrants. Oh joy. All right, bopping past Mexico again. Now we're going straight to one of the darkest days in U.S. history. World War II is, actually, I'm not even sure it had begun yet, but things are starting to happen in Germany. And you've probably all heard the story of the St. Louis carrying more than 900 Jewish folks fleeing the Nazis in Germany, docked in Havana, or tried to and got turned away, anchored off Miami Beach, got turned away. The United States invoked the usual arguments, oh, too many, and they might be spies, and the Coast Guard escorted them back to Europe with disastrous consequences. We get deeper into World War II. 1943, there were refugees flooding Europe already at a scale that had never before been seen. And so 44 nations met at the White House in November to talk about how to deal with it. They created the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA. And that mission was to repatriate and assist refugees, and they were also looking forward to the end of World War II when planning to provide economic assistance to the European nations to deal with all this. Now, to the US government's credit, in my estimation, they funded nearly half of UNRWA's budget, but they didn't say anything about letting in any more refugees to the United States. We still had those numerical limits. Then the war ended, thankfully. There were about 6 million displaced persons in Germany alone at the end of the war. Germany became sort of a center point because it was administered by the Allies, and UNRWA had a headquarters in Munich. That's bombed out Munich in the center there. On the left side, you see people waiting to get into a DP camp. On the right side, you see a couple of young refugees also waiting. Those of you who are sharp-eyed might recognize the tall girl on the left. And I hope we can all agree that she hasn't changed a bit. So at this point, there were many people who simply couldn't go back home for reasons we know. And the thing of it was, even though there was this international coordination, nations were setting their own rules. And what they wanted were preferably young, healthy workers, providing labor that they couldn't fill in their own workforce. That, of course, doesn't fit the bill for everyone. I'm going to use my family as an example again. Obviously, my mother and her little brother were not workers yet. Plus, my mom got tuberculosis, and that's a ground of exclusion. My grandfather was taking classes to try and make himself appealing to American or other society. He took classes in blacksmithing. So if America had needed a lot of horseshoes at that point, he was ready. Took classes in furniture inlay. Another one that didn't score him a job anytime quick. Unfortunately, he was an organist, and Americans were not looking for organists or composers or music teachers. And, you know, that's one person. We can imagine the scale of people trying to figure out what the various countries' requirements were, how they're going to meet them. And all this time waiting and waiting, which the idea that refugees pick up and move to a country because that's a cool thing to do and they'll like it better, which you hear sometimes, it's sort of absurd when you see what they actually go through. Okay. So they did come up with a Displaced Persons Act in June of 1948, which, if you do the math, is a few years after the end of the war. That was President Truman signing it. It allowed select European refugees, U.S. residents, with a maximum of 400,000, which compared to millions, I don't know. There on the right, you see a kid waiting to leave a DP camp for somewhere. And on the left, you once again see Mom right there in the middle. She's getting taller, you'll notice. Time is going by. But at least there was hope for some people in the United States to head to the United States and some other countries bit by bit. Another thing that happened in 1948 was the adoption by the United Nations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has some important language. And I think when I first read this, it all seemed obvious, and now today it seems incredibly important. Within the introduction, it says, the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Article 14, everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. They didn't define persecution. That's left for the courts. We can touch on that later. And then 1951, the Refugee Convention came along, defining refugees as anyone who can't return to their home country due to a well-founded fear of persecution, harm basically, based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And if you sort of stop and look at that, that covers the classic, say, dissident, you know, a person who, say, spoke out against an authoritarian regime in days gone by. It might not cover everyone who is fleeing difficult situations today, which is another thing we'll talk about a little later in the presentation. But the bottom line from this slide is we've signed all these conventions here in the United States. We are bound by international law to offer this sort of protection to refugees. All right, now I'm going to get super personal. Fast forward to 1990, when I graduated from law school. You can see my proud parents, little knowing that I was going to throw away the corporate career and go represent immigrants. I did take courses in immigration law and in international human rights law. I interned at Amnesty International. Those are some of their, actually I'm supposed to use the pointer. These are some of the lawyers and high-level folks at Amnesty International in London who do real live human rights law. And I got to ask them, how do you get to be a human rights lawyer? And they said, well, it's good to say go to someplace like Paraguay and you know, work with a union, and yeah, you might get killed in the process, but that's your start. And I thought, okay, I think I'll go home and do immigration law then. So let's see. So what I learned in law school was the definition of a refugee that I just read you. What I didn't so much learn until I got into practice is the practical realities, basically the different procedures. And this sounds like I'm heading off on a really dull topic, but this is crucial to understand to make any sort of decision or opinion about US policy. So someone becomes a refugee by fleeing their country and then applying to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, say in another country, if they can find their office, or sometimes the UN folks will come to a refugee camp. That's actually tents, if you can see that in the background there. Not an easy thing to do necessarily. You know, I've talked to refugees who have taken very, very, very long walks, and they might not have good methods of communication. But if they can find the UN, or the UN finds them, then they can put in an application. They can't request a country. They might not end up coming to the United States. But they will be placed, it's a formal process, and they'll get various benefits on arrival. Now, by contrast, someone becomes an asylee by getting to the US first, somehow. They can't apply from abroad. They do have to meet the same definition, but asylees are very different. So how do they get into the United States? Well, they can come to the US border, but the odds of getting in are getting less and less. It used to be that you could say, I would like to request asylum, and they'd say, okay, well, we'll give you this expedited interview to see if you really have a reasonable fear. If you sound credible, we send you on to a judge. That's happening less and less. The Biden administration tried to streamline it with an app called CBP-1, which assumed that all of these migrants from south of the border had an iPhone or a cell phone that they could use to make this appointment, which is a questionable proposition in and of itself. Plus, the app was glitchy and too many people were using it, and so it was sort of a bad scene. It's worse now because the Trump administration disabled the CBP-1 app and turned it into a self-deportation reporting app, which if anyone uses it, I will be very surprised. So yeah, coming to the US border, not a great thing. Getting a visa to the US, also unlikely. Let's say a tourist visa would be the obvious one. So if you're a campesino from El Salvador or something, and you show up at the US Embassy and say, I'd like a tourist visa, they will say to you, okay, where's your proof of your reasons for going back to your country? Where's your proof of income that you can support yourself? Where's your return plane ticket? Denied. There's crossing the border illegally. We know that happens plenty. Obviously not only by asylees, by many others, but it is a method by which someone seeking asylum can come to the United States. In the past, the illegal crossing has essentially been overlooked because the person was fleeing persecution. However, that's something else that is now going away. The Trump administration is issuing executive orders saying, no, we're not going to allow illegal aliens to apply for asylum. So who knows, really, where this is going to go. But those who do manage to make it in have 1 year in which to apply to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And, or if they get arrested, they can apply straight to an immigration judge. So if they're lucky, they get granted. But until that luck happens, they don't get any government help. They don't get a lawyer, which means just a much, much lower chance of gaining asylum because you have to position yourself to prove that whole ground of persecution structure that I mentioned before. And they don't get a work permit until they win their case, which can take years, especially if it goes to appeals. So I never actually worked much with refugees because of that whole separate system. I wanted just to quickly give a picture of what it means. By the way, just to go back in history, the World War II refugees had actual US sponsors who provided housing and support. That did since change. Now it goes through various organizations, like in Seattle, there's the International Rescue Committee and others, but they're the ones shown in the picture there. And they will actually meet the refugees when they arrive, provide initial housing, provide a whole bunch of other services listed here: transportation, enrolling kids in school, helping with doctors, health insurance, counselors, English classes, job training, job hunting, and seeking any public benefits for which they might be eligible. And my next slide is literally only because I was afraid someone would say, hey, where do most of the refugees come to the US from? I don't remember things like that, but we have a slide. So these days, this is 2023, most of them are from Congo, Syria, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Guatemala, Sudan, Venezuela, Somalia, Ukraine, Iraq, Colombia, and El Salvador. And I also just wanted us to compare that to other countries. So this is from the UN. 65% of refugees internationally come from only 4 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, and Afghanistan. 32% of them are first thing I wanted to mention is 71% end up hosted in low and middle income countries, 32% in just 5 countries, Iran, Turkey, Colombia, Germany, and Uganda. And if you see those numbers, they're all taking millions of refugees per country. Now we're going to look at the numbers in the United States. The refugee admissions number is set by the US president with congressional approval. It was averaging about 70,000 from 2013 to 15. Obama took it up to 85,000. Trump took it down to 50,000, then 40, then 30, then 18. Now, those organizations that I mentioned, like the IRC, those get federal funding to survive. They also ask for donations, but it's a large proportion of their budget that comes from federal funding. So when the president starts cutting budgets like that, what happens? Organizations close. In fact, the photo in the background here is of an organization in Austin, Texas that was serving refugees during the first Trump administration. Because of those cuts, it had to close its doors. Gone. Biden took the number up to 62,500 initially, but couldn't go further because the organizations that would serve them were trying to ramp up again. He then took it up to 125,000 that was meant to go through 2025. But in the recent change of administration, that number has been taken to 0. No more refugee admissions. The entire program suspended. People who had plane tickets to come to the United States were told, nope, cancel your ticket, you're staying home. How that ends up is an interesting question. Enter Washington State. I literally just saw these headlines today. Thank you, Seattle. I'm wondering if we know anybody in this picture there. I couldn't recognize anyone, but if you do, call it out. But a lawsuit was brought in federal court here. A judge temporarily blocked that refugee freeze. Appeals are pending. I have a feeling this administration is not rushing to undo things, but at least there's some hope there. We'll see. All right, back to the asylum seekers. This is what I did, is a lot of my immigration practice. That photo is of the Mission District in San Francisco, where I had a little low-rent office with some other immigration lawyers. It's not easy being an immigration lawyer. I made so little money that I didn't have to pay taxes my first year. And it didn't feel right to charge high fees to people who couldn't get a work permit until they won their case, who were standing outside Home Depot waiting for some work, who were needing counseling because they would wake up with nightmares from past trauma and this sort of thing. But it's a fascinating line of work too. So I never knew who would walk in the door, whether I would even know on a map where they'd come from. I had clients from Guatemala, El Salvador, Jordan, Somalia, Kashmir, Nigeria, and more. In case it wasn't clear, the government wasn't paying me at all, and a lot of people just couldn't find or afford a lawyer at all. So I would now like to use some of my clients, and then some not, as examples where maybe we can talk about who do you think on this list would actually have a decent case for asylum. And actually, this might take some mic running. Let's see here. We might be able to yell out. We can start with a yes, no, and if you can give me a quick reason, I'll try and repeat that too. So let's say we have a woman from Pakistan whose husband is a powerful politician who beats her. Asylum, yes or no? All right, I'm hearing a mix of yes, no. I think I can guess the reasons, so I'll just sort of explain what some of the rationale would be for any decision. This is a possibility. You wouldn't think she would fit into any of the grounds. Race, no. Religion, no. Nationality, no. Political opinion, no. Membership in a particular social group, gender is not a social group. But with some creative lawyering, which I certainly didn't pioneer, but I piggybacked on, we were actually able to make arguments in cases like this to say, well, her political opinion is that she doesn't want to be beaten. Don't laugh. And although it was a personal matter, which would normally be a disqualifying sort of thing, her own government was failing to protect her. That's something that you find often in cases where someone flees their country due to domestic violence. You know, they can't just go down the road or get help from the policeman. They have to leave the entire country because of that failure to protect. That makes the government sort of an actor in that thing, in that event. So possible case there. How about a policeman from Guatemala who gets death threats from guerrillas? I'm hearing yeses and nos again. All right, well, you're sort of both right. He could be called a particular social group. Normally it's supposed to be a characteristic you can't change, but once you've been a policeman and everybody knows you as such, and you've been taking part in actions to combat, say, a guerrilla force, it's going to be hard to walk that back. So social group, yes, possibilities. The death threats give him a reasonable fear of persecution. There is a problem with this case, though. I did represent basically this person. Problem number one is that there are various bars to asylum. One of them is persecution of others. Policemen in Guatemala stand a fair chance of having been up to some pretty negative deeds vis-a-vis the guerrillas. And so persecution of others very likely could be a bar to asylum. Funnily enough, it didn't come up. This is one of these odd lawyer moments for me, because I was representing the guy because that was my job as a lawyer, and he had very cute children, and I wanted to help them. I did not like this man. And so while I was in immigration court, I was sort of trying to mentally, send messages to the other lawyer, the government lawyer, and the judge saying, ask him about persecution of others. You know, I wasn't going to do that. I'm his lawyer. And they didn't. But the guy also couldn't keep his story straight, so he was denied on credibility grounds. Which, actually, I have to say, credibility is a tough one, because it's not always someone who's lying. If you asked me, or I'm guessing many ordinary people, to name like the dates when something happened, I can't even remember my own wedding date, frankly. And you get these people in court, and they're supposed to say, oh, and then the van was following me on this date, and then I got a death threat on that date. They expect you to have all of that straight. So credibility is a tough one. Actually, I think my wedding was August 15th, so. All right, how about Mexican children whose parents died in a wildfire and who live in an area controlled by drug cartels? I'm hearing yeses and nos again. This is a problematic one because they don't fall into any of those grounds, especially if Mexican. Race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. No, 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 no. The wildfire probably caused by climate change, not necessarily a government policy. Drug cartels are generalized crime that the government is probably trying to do something about. So I would not take this case, unless there's something else in there. And I didn't have to. This is more of a recent modern problem. But that's going to be a tough one. And actually, very few people from Mexico gain asylum for any reason. The only promising ground of asylum has been gay or HIV positive applicants, because there is evidence of mistreatment of that group, and that's considered a particular social group. As for the rest, there's not much to work with using the existing asylum definition. How about a Nigerian woman who demonstrated against the abuses of Shell Oil in her country, which was drilling and mistreating local tribes and the land, and she received threats? Excellent. Yes. I did have this particular case. She was granted asylum. I will mention that one of the challenges, though, in this case for her was getting to the United States. She managed to get a visa. No. I think she tried to get a visa and failed. She bought herself a fake visa to the United States. Someone created a very convincing version of a visa. It convinced me. I looked at it and presented a copy to the court, and only got surprised in the middle of a hearing to find out that no, she'd committed fraud, which is another bar to asylum. Fortunately, it's one that can be overcome if you can show that it was connected to your need to flee persecution. So we took a break from the hearing. We came back with a full apology and explanation and whatever, and she was granted asylum, and deservedly so, I think. All right, here's another one that did not happen during my time in active practice, but is certainly relevant now. Let's say a Ukrainian family whose home was destroyed during, say by bombs, during the Russian hostilities. Yes, no, yes, no. All right. Yeah, we'd like to say yes. So this is a challenging one because war is not personal. There's no way you can say, first of all, that their own government was doing anything to persecute them. It's not their own government, it's the Russian government. They don't fit into one of those 5 grounds. That nexus is key. However, I have heard of cases where the argument is that the Russian government is attempting genocide. That does make it based on nationality. And although that's not their government, their own government cannot protect them from that genocide. So that puts it back in the realm of a possible asylum claim. I don't anticipate that all immigration officers or judges will go for this argument, but some have, and so it has promise. How about a Somalian youth who is a victim of tribal violence and has the injuries to show for it? That's an easy case as far as at least granting the asylum. And this is one of my favorite clients, actually, a very sweet young man. For him, the bigger challenge, again, was getting to the United States. First, he's from Somalia. First, he says he walked to Djibouti. That's another country. And I have to tell a quick funny story about this. One time we were helping him prepare for some hearing or something, and he politely asked how I was doing, and I mentioned that I had just come back from camping with some friends, and that I wasn't a big fan of camping. And his English was pretty good, but he didn't know this word. He said, "What's camping?" And I said, "Well, it's when you walk all day, then pitch a tent, then you're freezing, and you have to make your own food, and you haven't had a shower in a long time." And he paused and he said, "Ilona, they have this in my country too. But we don't call it camping." So what he ended up doing to get to the United States was actually get a ticket to Mexico because he was not allowed a visa to the United States. He then had to find a coyote to help him across the Mexican border into the United States, and then eventually found his way to me and then could apply for asylum. All right, last but not least, Salvadoran gay HIV positive male who fears harassment. Yep. He's got the social group, he's got the legitimate fear, definite evidence of persecution in that country. That's an actual case I had, and yes, he was granted asylum. Now, having gone through those, you might notice that we talked a lot about particular social group. It's sort of a catch-all for when nothing else fits. And, sometimes we're really cramming something into that category, but if it's a sympathetic case, that can be made to work. If anyone has looked at or heard of Project 2025, the Trump administration's plans, they would like to get rid of the particular social group category. I don't know where that's going to end up. It hasn't actually been raised yet that I've seen in this administration. It would violate international law, and executive orders, even though they're being issued thick and fast, are truly not meant to change law. They're only supposed to tell agencies, say, how to enforce the law or how to interpret the law. But when you go right into the law and excise a big section of it, that's not supposed to happen. The courts should stop it. If the Supreme Court cooperates, it should, I mean, it's so obvious that this is right there in the law. That should stay there. But what happens, I'm not going to be a prophet and attempt to say. All right, one more set of statistics just for curiosity. Here's where most people who are granted asylum in the U.S. come from. We've got Afghanistan, China, Venezuela, El Salvador, India, Guatemala, Honduras, Russia, Turkey, and Colombia. This is from 2021 to 23, so this sort of reflects history a little bit, because by the time they get granted, years have gone by. And you might be wondering why China. There is actually a special little clause in the law that says you have grounds for asylum if you're a victim or think you will be of forced abortion. It was written for China, and it's primarily used by China. Yep. Okay, so actually, we are making good time and have reached the end of my formal thoughts on the whole matter. But I thought we could go in two directions. One might be, if you're interested, to just talk a little more about how we think the U.S. should structure this asylum refugee system. Having heard all of this, does anything stand out as a way to bridge this odd sort of divide between the refugees and the asylees, how to deal with things at the border? I mean, maybe we should just stop there and see if anyone has any thoughts that they want to share. And we have some mic runners here, so I'll ask folks to raise a hand, and then I'll bring you a mic. Any thoughts?
I'm a little surprised that there's no consideration given to employability. I would have thought that would be a factor.
You and the immigrants too, actually. And it's funny because we have a labor shortage in this country. I've seen speeches by the Cato Institute, which is not known for being some liberal bastion, talking about there's a huge lack of people willing to do especially menial labor. There are not Americans who are going to fill that. Meanwhile, we have immigrants and refugees who want to be here. Like, this should be a natural joining of things. And not just for the refugees and asylees, but for others who are interested in this. But even refugees and asylees, when I was counseling someone for a court hearing or something, I would have to remind them, don't say I can be a good worker. Because they would naturally think that this was a plus. I'm not here to mooch off the system, I'm here to work. But as soon as you start saying things like, I can be a good worker, you get dubbed an economic migrant, which is not an asylee, or not someone fleeing persecution. The one and only thing on their mind is supposed to be fleeing persecution. So yes, we have an odd disjuncture there. Someone way over there.
You hear a lot about, we get a lot of human trafficking. And so how do you sift through that with finding out whether there is human trafficking or a trafficker? How does that get sorted out?
Yeah, that is actually a separate category. I have not dealt with people who are victims of human traffickers, but there's something called a T visa, T for trafficking, that is available to those folks. Of course, they have to get free and find their way to a lawyer. It's a challenging thing. That might be why I don't even come across many mentions of it. So there's that. There's also something called a U visa, which is somewhat related, and it's for people who have been victims of crime in the United States and who are assisting law enforcement. And the idea is that we don't want them to be deported before they can show up and be a witness against the criminal. And if they stay around long enough and, can fulfill other requirements like pass the security checks and whatever, they can actually get U.S. green cards.
The recent case that's just came up with the Venezuelan immigrants were flown to El Salvador.
Yeah.
The court ruled, no, you can't do that, but they sent a second plane load anyway. So the question is, how does the court enforce their decision?
That is the question of the hour. This is sort of an unspoken, I don't want to say weakness in our legal system, but it's just something that you can't do anything about unless there's some higher authority, and who's that going to be? Even if I go into small claims court and win a $500 judgment from a landlord who, did something messy on my lease or something, I don't really have much of a way to enforce that. And then you take it up to the level of the Department of Justice or an entire administration, and we're talking a serious a gap. Like, truly, the only thing you can do is keep issuing orders. It sort of leaves it up to the public to make noise and embarrass them.
We have a mic here.
Oh, he's just a follow-up, I guess. Oh, it's off, yeah.
The director of ICE said he would not enforce the court rulings. Cannot the court hold him in contempt?
Sounds good. I think that's a fine plan. I haven't heard of that being in the offing, but I don't actually say why not, so I like it.
So he could be sentenced to 30 days in jail if they could round him up.
Perfect. Let's get on the phone and lobby for that.
Here,
Next.
here is
Over there.
where are you? There's a novel called American Dirt, which is suspenseful, written from a sometimes explicitly Christian point of view. But it's about a mother and her son escaping from the cartel who has murdered her family in Mexico and getting into the United States. It's an excellent novel, and it opened my mind to the whole immigration from Mexico problem. I just highly recommend it.
All right, book recommendation, American Dirt. Over there.
You mentioned people get up and they have to remember dates and places. Is there a requirement that they bring written documentation to these hearings?
That's an excellent question. It's sort of a joke in the immigration lawyer community that what people need is a note from their dictator. But what are the odds, as we know? So it's extremely rare to have anything other than sort of secondary evidence. So part of the reason I didn't earn much money as an immigration lawyer is that I got a little too fascinated by the research. So I would spend long hours pouring through old stacks of the Pakistani Times to find mention of the student demonstration that my client said he had participated in, hoping against hope for a photo or something. And usually I was not successful. In rare cases, you can at least find someone who can vouch for them. Like I had one case of a Guatemalan man who was the secretary of his cooperative in a village in the jungle. He was Mayan, Indian. And I've mentioned this to people before, so apologies if you're hearing it for the second time. But his village was targeted by the authorities at that time. They thought a cooperative was communism. And so they were, circling. This guy already knew that he was under threat. He was starting to sort of hide out in the jungle. And then the Guatemalan army came in and massacred his entire village. And so he was off in the jungle thinking that the screams he was hearing included his own wife and children, at which point he hightailed it to the United States. Now, there had been an anthropologist working in that region of Guatemala, And I was actually able to contact him and say, my client is Felipe. Do you know him? Can you write something on his behalf? And he did. He was willing to do that. That felt like a small miracle. Unfortunately, we were up against just one of the nastiest judges in the immigration court down in San Francisco, who would just sit and glower and turn red with anger. And he died young of a stroke, and I think I know why. And he denied the case. So we had to take it up to the Board of Immigration Appeals and then the Ninth Circuit Federal Court. Fortunately, because we had built a record that included things like that statement, he was eventually granted. And the original judge had to sign off on that, and my client called me, and at this point I was in another job and I wasn't working with him directly, but he said, you know, the judge was bien enojado, like very angry. So yeah, any kind of evidence is important, but few people know to bring anything with them, you know, even so much as a union card or something when they're fleeing for their life.
So you may not want to go here, but even after one attains asylum, and even if you get a green card, it looks like you're not safe. And I'm looking at the case of Muhammad Khalil, you know, who has a green card, an American citizen wife, and his son deported for expressing his opinion about the situation in Gaza.
Sure, yeah.
And, you know, so what, and I remember John Oliver talking about how relieved he was the day he got his U.S. citizenship, because having a green card made him feel vulnerable every year. And so, you know, the system, even beyond getting and receiving asylum or refugee status, seems to me so vulnerable at the moment. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, it's absolutely true, and that is changing. So asylees can apply for a green card after 1 year in asylum status. And there's already a little bit of an issue there where if things have changed in the home country, and say they've signed peace accords or they passed a new law saying don't persecute homosexuals, your asylum can be revoked, and that's it. You have to go back because it's supposedly safe to do so. Also, of course, if you've committed any crimes or gotten into trouble, that would be a reason to deny the green card and possibly deport you. You know, the immigration system used to be a little more tolerant on these points. I have had a case where it was revealed that the client had committed some fraud in obtaining his asylum, and the green card was denied, but they did not move to deport him. I was surprised. That would not happen now. Then even after you have a green card, you can be deported if you commit a crime. You can be deported if you fail to advise the U.S. government of your change of address within 10 days of moving. They didn't used to use that much, but I'm a little worried about what's coming. This case of Khalil, that basically shouldn't happen unless there's some information that we don't have. It seems like they are just acting without due process, frankly, and intending to create fear, which it is certainly doing. So the safest bet for a lot of people might be to apply for U.S. citizenship, except that is also a chance to reopen the file and go back and check every little part of it to make sure that there was no funny business in the past. There are definite risks to applying to citizenship, because if they notice that maybe there was something unlawful about the way you obtained the green card, then the green card's gone and then you're out on your ear once again. I'm sort of glad I'm not applying for, I'm not actively working as a lawyer right now. If you know immigration lawyers, give them a hug, because they're going through some hard times. Looks like here, or?
Hi, Ilona.
Yeah.
Just to get off the current political scene a little bit, how do other countries handle the business of appropriate number of refugees?
I'm not a huge expert on that. We definitely know from the headlines that it can be contentious. Like Germany was very generous for a while under Angela Merkel, And then people started to feel like that's a bit much, like, I'm being intruded upon. And Merkel's gone, and things have gone back again. Many of those that are taking in refugees are doing so from the immediate countries next door to them. It might be just partly a matter of, well, we've got to do it. Now, I do find it interesting that so many refugees are being taken in by lower income countries. Part of that might suggest, gosh, they're being generous. It might also be, though, that economically they're looking at this as a source of labor, being realistic. So, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I wish I could tell you more about the answer, but I don't know.
You mentioned the grounds for getting a refugee status or asylee status. You didn't mention what measures are taken to identify undesirables. By that I mean criminals. And I'm asking the question because Trump made some political hay by saying that all these people who are invading our country are criminals and all of that. And the likelihood is it's tiny. But how does the screening process look for and catch people who are undesirable because they are a criminal?
Yeah, everyone who applies for asylum or any immigration benefit has to supply their fingerprints and other biographical information. And it all gets run through FBI databases, international law enforcement databases. In some of the other categories of immigration, like family, you would also have to provide police certificates from your home country saying that you haven't been in any of various sorts of trouble. So everything is vetted, and it has been for many, many years. And to say otherwise is just wrong. Now, does it catch everybody? No. Some people will change their name, not have fingerprints on file, and not be the most savory of characters. But by and large, the statistics on commission of crime by immigrants in the United States are much lower than the numbers of crimes committed by Americans. So there's a lot of political hay being made. Who else have we got? I've lost track of who's.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions about the good old days, which included students coming here for reputable places to study, and actually, if they stayed here and got
H-1B?
particularly good, either ways of making sure that they would be good for us, that they would be very welcome. And the other was when there was a lookout for people who had particular studies, not study skills, but skills that people that were wanted. Do you think those are going to stay here?
In theory, they're not number one on the chop list, but there's just such a hostility in the current administration to all immigrants that it's kind of hard to know. Every type of visa category, and I'm hearing this from lawyers who are saying, why? This is just a simple, say, a marriage visa case, where it could be a perfectly straightforward case. The couple's living together, they have children together. In the past, that would be something that would be a quick interview. You look at their wedding pictures and ask a few questions, and it's clear, off they go. Now the examiners are going down every single question on the application. Interviews are taking double the time. And frankly, fewer students are coming to the United States because they're a little worried about the way things are going. So if you go back to Project 2025, that said that the immigration bureaucracy should be turned into something where the primary focus is ferreting out fraud. And so that sweeps across all of the categories. They will stay there. And as you mentioned, there are also various work visa categories. Those still exist. They're mostly for high-level skilled sorts of workers, technology fields, any professional field you can think of that's not hand labor, you have a decent chance of getting a green card, even if it takes a number of years. But if you have an employer and they're willing to go through the sponsorship process, yes, that avenue remains. It will just be apparently a much bigger hassle before, and possibly quite unpleasant, with this sort of cloud of the presumption of fraud in the air.
Your last question, how might we help people who can't get visas, etc.? Going back to my own history, it was a farmer, who got us a sponsorship. They sponsored us. And I think this is possibly where we is going to come in as a force, that we, the people, in some way, and again, we will have to go through immigration lawyers, immigration, ACLU, asylum seeker organizations to help. But I think it's going to be very much the individuals who are going to step in, and I hope that they do, because if it hadn't been for that, I and many, you for that matter, would not be here. It is thank you to the American people who created possibilities for people to come. It was not the government. The government, yes, finally allowed a certain number of people, but it was the individual Americans who said, yes, we will help. So I hope that happens again.
Over here? Where are you taking, I'm over here on the other side. In the years past, churches filled that kind of sponsorship role a lot. And I'm wondering what evidence is that they continue that in the numbers that they used to, or whether that has been discouraged now.
So churches are still important players in the immigration context, in terms of, I don't want to get too deep into the whole sanctuary movement, because it makes it sound like they can do more than they can, but they are trying to provide welcoming places and coordinate efforts to get services to immigrants.
This is not what I'm asking.
Right.
They were acted as sponsors.
Yep, and that's what I'm leading up to.
You talked about individuals acting as sponsors, but it was kind of like sponsor.
Right, that's no longer possible. There have been, over the years, various ways in which actual sponsorship could happen, and those programs have basically been done away with. There was what was it called, Welcome something during the Biden administration. I hadn't even heard of it then, and that actually allowed for individual sponsorship. That's been closed, obviously. So at this point, the more indirect help is going to be the main one that's significant. Getting in touch with churches and other organizations that are doing what they can to perhaps coordinate with lawyers and with anyone else who can stand up for someone, offer family support. One of the biggest issues right now is this matter of mass deportations, where they're not as mass as is said, because there isn't the person power to do that, but they are very theatrical. They're going into public places, they're going into schools and whatever, kind of to get on television. And that's an instance where other people can play an individual role by just at least saying to someone, you can call me, I'll pick your kids up at school, I'll watch your house if the worst happens or something. And that can be coordinated through organizations. So we're sort of at the end of the hour. So do we have time for one more question? Okay, Judy.
I'd like to just explore even a little deeper. If I were coming to this country as a refugee, how would I know how to find support, financial, legal, so on?
So if you're coming on your own, not through the UN program, but someone who meets the definition of a refugee and then is seeking asylum, it seems to me that it's word of mouth. You know, people go to their own communities usually. Hopefully they know someone somewhere, or they manage to find a community organization. But it's very hit and miss. I'm amazed that people are able to find things at all, and some don't. Some get past that required 1-year period of applying for asylum, and then the door shuts. Now, for extraordinary circumstances, you can say, oh, please, I had no idea. I don't speak English. I, didn't know what the rules were. I couldn't find a lawyer. We make this weird assumption that people somehow know that they have a year to present this particular application to the U.S. government, which they don't. So, a certain amount of luck involved there.
Thanks. I just want to give a big thanks to Ilona. I think this has been an extremely informative talk, and we really appreciate her being here and sharing with us. So thank you very much. Let's give her another round of applause.